Okay, check 1 2, check 1 2. Testing, testing. Looks good. Hello, everybody. Please hit the like button and go ahead and ask any questions that you have in the chat. This should be a great stream tonight. But hitting that like button does help with the algorithm. I hate pushing it. I feel ridiculous. I'm not a natural salesman, but I do understand the need for it, or the utility of it, I will say. Um, okay, so tonight we are going to talk about Curt Jaimungal's most recent stream with Bernardo Kastrup and Chris Langan. I thought it was great. I'm really glad that that happened. I think that the topics that were discussed were awesome. I think both of them did a great job discussing all the various topics that they discussed and that we're going to touch on. There's definitely some difficulties in explaining some of those things because there's just seems to be some, I guess, linguistic challenges when it comes to addressing some of these things. We're going to discuss those because I have like a lot of thoughts on it, but I think it was a great stream. The link is down below, and I highly recommend checking it out. It's about 2 hours, and it's worth watching every second of it. I think that it's great. I'm really glad that they did that. But I have a number of clips to go through, and I'm going to try and move kind of quickly because there is a lot of clips, and I know that I tend to ramble. But and we got started a bit later because I was still just detailing some final clips that I wanted to, my thoughts on some final clips that I wanted to address from this stream. But there's a lot, and like I said, highly recommend it. This is the stream right here. Curt Jaimungal's channel, Theories of Everything. Huge fan of this channel. And I think that these theolocutions, as they're being called, are awesome. One of the problems of this theory of everything space has always been, and I think there's a number of reasons for this. One, breaking new ground requires making new terminology, and that makes it difficult to understand each other. Two, there's a lot of competition and ego, I guess, involved in trying to come up with the theory of everything that becomes accepted, and also, like I said, it's not just breaking new ground with new terminology being required. It's a new field to do metaphysics today, I would say, even though it's an ancient field of study, probably the most ancient field of study, but it is also kind of the newest field of study as well, and the final field of study. So that causes difficulty with just people speaking together. It's not the same as physics and stuff, where there's these institutions that are already in place to help, group people together and facilitate discussion and exchange of ideas. But channels like Curt's and even like Brian Keating's channel and a number of others are great for this. I've seen, and I think it's really pushing science forward, to be honest. So these theolocutions, super awesome. They're very genuine discussions, and that's good because that was kind of missing until about a few years ago. I think we're starting to almost take that for granted at this point in this field of like metaphysics and philosophy and physics. because those discussions normally happened behind closed doors, but they're starting to happen more publicly, and that's very good. So I really like Chris Langan and Bernardo Kastrup's ideas and work, and I seem to agree with them on most things. I'm not as familiar with Kastrup's work, but I'm getting more familiar with it, I've never read the CTMU through and through, but I am familiar enough with it. So, background on these two guys, and then I'm going to get started. So, Chris Langan, I'm going to give my background with Chris Langan because it's interesting. So, Chris Langan, when I was in college, I've shared this before, I didn't decide. I needed to try in school for the first time, or else I was going to fail and I'd not get into my program for my major. Never the best student. I never did my homework. I decided to do my homework for the first time these years in college, and I realized I went from being one of the worst people in the class to like the top of every class that I was in. And I started really getting interested in just intellectually challenging myself for the first time in as much as possible, like intentionally, even though I do enjoy, intellectual challenges and puzzles and things like that, problem solving. But this was very much more academic. And I breezed through school that year and got A's in every class, and I was the top of every class. And that's not gloating. I'm just telling you, like, I just was. I tried really hard. I mean, I went to it wasn't like it was difficult for me, but it did take effort. I will say that. I went to the study sessions. I did all my homework assignments. I did study after school. So I did go to class. So like that year, other years, no, I didn't go to class. I didn't do my homework, etc. But it did result in me kind of breezing through. And I started researching IQ, and I came across Chris Langan, and I saw that he had come up with this theory of everything, the CTMU, and I had not experienced any intellectual challenges that entire year, and I was like, okay, let me see if I can figure out this CTMU. I could not at all. I couldn't even understand the line of it. I couldn't understand the name of it, the Cognitive Theoretic Model of the Universe. I was like, what the heck is that? I just saw a couple videos of him trying to explain he like mathematically could prove God or something, and I was totally lost, and I was honestly pissed about it because it was the first time I had felt stupid in a year. And I eventually just was like, whatever, I don't have a 200 IQ, so that's got to be what this is. And I forgot about it. And then, as a number of you know, I had a theophany about 6 years ago. And after that, I kind of just shifted my perspective on the universe and started to think of it as it's probably a being and God was probably real. And that had implications on physics that started to become intuitive. And then I had like an epiphanies about the universe and the nature of it and the structure of it. And I was like, I wonder if I would understand that one guy's theory of everything. I couldn't even remember his name. And I went back and I, looked up man with the highest IQ and came across him, obviously, and looked up his Cognitive Theoretic Model of the Universe, and I read just the name of it, and I immediately knew exactly what it was discussing. And I've never read through the CTMU in any really detailed fashion. I do look up terms that I hear Chris mention in interviews, like teller and stuff like that I don't know, so I have to look them up. But I've never read through the CTMU. But I will say it seems like most of it comes almost completely intuitively to me now. And that's not a gloating statement. What's fascinating about that is that my IQ didn't go up. But I went from not understanding the cognitive theoretic model of the universe at all to basically deducing it on my own and understanding it completely, essentially, and without any study and without any IQ boost. It was just a shift in perspective. So I say that to highlight just a fascinating story about like my introduction to Chris Langan, but also to show that IQ is very useful. It's kind of like how powerful is the engine in your car, how fast can it drive. But a Toyota Civic and a Lamborghini will both get you to the supermarket. One will get you there faster, but they will both get you to the supermarket. And IQ is not a substitute for understanding. Although I do think Chris Langan has a very good understanding of the universe, I'm just saying I know many people with very high IQs, much higher than mine, who do not understand the universe at all. And so it is not the end-all be-all, but it is useful. So Chris Langan's theory, the CTMU, Cognitive Theoretic Model of the Universe, is his own theory. It basically is that the universe is a mind and is that it's God, and I tend to agree with almost all of it, and that I've know of, and also the guy used to. This is a little bit of background on him. Kind of identify with him a little bit in that he's an autodidact completely, which I think most people who are like the top of their fields are, but also not top of their fields, that's the wrong way to say it, but people who are truly competent in anything are self-taught. Partially, at least. You know, that doesn't mean they didn't have mentors. But he does have the highest IQ measured in America, between 195 and 210, which is extraordinarily high, far, far, far higher than mine. And he came from a non-academic background, and I identify with that quite a bit. I never really did well in school other than that 1 year that I talked about, and which ironically introduced me to Chris Langan, but I do not, actually I'm not a fan of most academic institutions at all, and but he kind of, you can look up his background, and just came from not an academic background, which I think is a good thing. I don't think coming from an academic background serves you very much in this pursuit, because in order to come up with the next evolution of scientific understanding, which is metaphysics, you have to throw out Babylon, which is the like divided fields of study. And so to be intrinsically tied to all these terms and structures and rules and things coming from other subjective relativistic fields is not really a positive. So I think that part of the reason why he has been so successful with the CTMU is not necessarily just because of his IQ, I'm sure it helps, but also because he doesn't come from an academic background. But Bernardo Kastrup is the next guy. Does he have a Wikipedia? I'm hoping. Make this easier. Interesting. We're just going to look at his website. This is his website. And he pushes analytic idealism, and that's his main focus. Idealism is that the existence is fundamentally ideas, and that we are inside a mind, essentially. The universe is a mind, and that, instead of placing materialism as fundamental, kind of places ideas in a mind as fundamental. I'm not the biggest fan of the term idealism. I think it's just the same as saying, it's not the same as saying materialism, but it's not fundamental. I do understand that it's understood to mean like we're inside a mind, but that being that is having those ideas, that's fundamental reality, not the ideas themselves. Those ideas change and shift, but the being that is having those ideas is fundamental reality. That is why that is a sentient being. The universe is a sentient being, according to my theory, sentient singularity theory, which is very similar to Bernardo Kastrup's ideas, it seems, and Chris Langan's. But I wouldn't describe myself as an idealist, even though I do think that idealism and materialism are two sides of one coin, and ideas are more fundamental than materialism. Idealism is more fundamental than materialism, but more fundamental than idealism is the being that is having those ideas, and that's why I would call myself a theist, not an idealist, not a materialist. What we observe as matter or concrete reality is just the thoughts of God. It's the ideas of God. And so I don't disagree with idealism's fundamental assumptions, but I do disagree with it as its terminology. But Kastrup is the executive director of the Essentia Foundation. His work has been leading the modern renaissance of metaphysical idealism, the notion that reality is essentially mental. He has a PhD in philosophy, ontology, philosophy of mind, and another PhD in computer engineering, reconfigurable computing, artificial intelligence. As a scientist, Bernardo has worked for European Organization for Nuclear Research, CERN, and Phillips Research Laboratories, where the Casimir effect of quantum field theory was discovered. Formulated in detail in many academic papers and books, his ideas have been featured in Scientific American and the Institute of Art and Ideas, in the blog of American Philosophical Association, and Big Think, among others. Okay, that is his background. Yep, okay. First clip while I look at some questions. Curt casts so far haven't been bad as far as learning his without stuff attached. I'm not exactly sure. This is a conversation between people that are not me on the chat, so just making sure there's no questions. Okay. But okay, we'll start here. So many clips, but we're gonna move quickly. But they're good. Come on, computer. Okay.
Metal and physical sides of reality, what I say is nonsense. It takes this metaformal approach and this metaformal meta language that I'm talking. Simply no way to do it. So this dualism between the metal and physical sides of reality, what I say is nonsense. It takes this metaformal approach and this metaformal meta language that I'm talking.
Bernardo, do you have any thoughts on that? Or questions?
Chris jumped into probably more details of his theory, which I'm not acquainted with. So if I start asking questions now, he'll probably speak for the next 2 hours just for me to understand something I should have understood by reading a paper, which I haven't read. So I'm not going to tax you with this, Chris.
Yeah, well, what I was trying to answer more or less was the idea of what metaphysics is and how consciousness relates to metaphysics. Okay, so what I'm saying is that metaphysics has to be this metaformal meta language, and consciousness relates to it as a distributed property thereof.
That would be your particular usage of the word metaphysics. Or metaphysics is a word that has been used since the pre-Socratics. So there is a sort of a common meaning for the word in philosophy. Metaphysics, that which stands behind physics, or the essence or the beingness of things, as opposed to appearances and behavior.
Precisely. I'm saying that has to take the form of a metaformal meta language of the mental and physical sides of reality. In other words, it's going to span between both of those things, building a bridge between them. That's the purpose of metaphysics. And I understand that many different people have defined it in many different ways. And the long and short of it is, although I respect people having their own ideas about things, I don't find that especially useful. You can go and look at everybody's definition and not come out with anything very stable that it can work with. So I settled on a mathematical structure that I can work with to make sense of these concepts, these metaphysical concepts.
I would agree with that definition. I think that defining these things is really tough because it's not tough. It's tough to have a shared definition, and it's very critical to moving this forward. It's funny. I took a philosophy class that one semester that I did, or year that I did really well in school. It was my first and only philosophy class that I took. It was the Ethics of Healthcare, it was called. And it was the best class, the best I've ever done in any class. And it was the last class I ever wanted to take. I thought philosophy was like poetry or something, and I just had no interest whatsoever. And but it ended up being an incredibly interesting class, and my philosophy professor, said to me, the definition of philosophy is the study of perspective. And that really resonates with me to this day, and he basically used that as the objective definition to the class, and that's almost the definition of metaphysics as well, according to what Chris is using, which I agree with that definition. It's kind of like building the bridge. It's the study of what is objective being, what is actually there, not what is the emergently appearing before us, but also it is the building of the bridge between the physical and the mental structures of reality. And I think that makes a lot of sense. But if you look up philosophy definition, the study of the fundamental nature of knowledge, reality, and existence. So it's basically metaphysics, especially when considered in an academic discipline, as an academic discipline. But then people say a lot, which is philosophy means the love of wisdom, I think is, philosophy. Quite literally, the term philosophy means the love of wisdom. In a broad sense, philosophy is an activity people undertake when they seek to understand fundamental truths about themselves, and the world they live in, and their relationship to the world and each other. I think that makes sense, but at the same time, when we're thinking about it as a field of study, I like the study of perspective better than the love of wisdom. I think I think the love of wisdom is what leads you to doing philosophy, but it's not. But if it is a field of study, then it is the study of perspective. And then I would say that metaphysics is the study of fundamental nature of reality and existence, and coupling mental and physical structures. By the way, please comment in the chat what if the stream is smooth or choppy, but it should be good. But I just want to make sure. So interesting, but I would agree. I thought this was also a great quote by Bernardo. This next, when they were he comes from a background in computer science, and I in my investigations into like first principles investigations into what is
So how about we talk about
computation.
computation? So what does computation mean? What is reality's relationship to computation?
I will say that my determination is that I would agree with what Bernardo has to say here.
Obviously, that depends on one's definition of reality. Let me tell you the reason why I'm asking this question. It's because some people think that our conscious experience is generated by an algorithmic process, and then some people don't think that. So, for example, Penrose, famously. And secondly, some people think reality is understood as, or is equivalent to computation. So, Wolfram, for example. Again, the question is, what is computation and what is its relationship to reality? Bernardo.
In its most generic definition, computation just means changes of state. When future states depend on previous states, then you have a computation. It's the function by means of which you create future states based on past states. That's the most generic possible definition of computation. Some of the other things you brought up attach more qualifications to the word computation. Wolfram considers the laws of physics to be emergent from cellular automata-like computation. In other words, local computations based on simple rules. So now you're not saying only computation, now you're specifying more what kind of computation is involved. Then you have digital physics, in which the idea is that the laws of physics should be reducible to digital computations. So you're specifying what kind of computation. There are there has been analog computers in our history, and less than 100 years ago. So computation is not only digital. So most people, when they say, well, nature is a computer, usually they mean something more than to just say computations happen, because yes, computations happen. The state of the universe is changing, so it's computing by definition. There is nothing metaphysically polemical or complicated about it. It is when you add more qualifications to what you mean, that's where it gets tricky. When you say, for instance, that consciousness does not have a nontic reality of its own, but is the result of a computation and therefore epiphenomenal in some sense. Now you're saying more than just that the universe computes. Now you're saying not only does the universe compute, sometimes it structures its computations in such a way that it produces an epiphenomenal result that we know as consciousness. Now you're saying something distinct and absolutely wrong and internally contradictory and incoherent and explanatorily powerless. But at least you are saying something.
I totally agree with that. Consciousness is not the result of computation. It cannot be. And, you know, people can get into what types of computation. There is quantum computation, and quantum computation is part of consciousness, it's more fundamental part of the structure of mind, I guess, of the process that mind goes through, which is a sentient being structure. But it's not. But you cannot get a consciousness by, or general intelligence, or AGI, or anything like that, with pure binary computing. You just can't. Obviously, the universe has binary computing as part of it, but it's not fundamental. It's emergent, and you cannot use binary computing to generate consciousness. Their reason why is what they'll get into it, but I totally agree with it, is that it doesn't allow for the right degrees of freedom necessary to basically have will, but not even just will. It also doesn't, I would add to that, it doesn't allow for imagination. You can look on my channel, and there's a short video. It's probably like a minute, and it shows quantum computation versus binary computation to some degree, or classical computation, in just a model that I made. It's animated, and it just kind of shows like very, very fundamentally like what the process is. for each of them, and kind of why one is so much more efficient than the other when it comes to certain types of computing, I guess you would say. But one of them is kind of allows for awareness to be leveraged, which is quantum computation. But that's not really possible in classical computation. You can look into it, but this is what they had said about it. But to say computation is the changing of states of things, I don't know if that's the exact definition of it. I'm not a computer scientist, but at least by academic accreditation. But I would agree with that. But this is what they had to say about it, and why binary computing does not allow for consciousness to manifest. So people that say
recursive process that can either do things deterministically, like Bernardo was talking about,
that we just need a network of computers and then we'll be able to make a consciousness with just the right code. That's nonsense. There is no neural net that results in consciousness. You can't do it with a binary computer. There's a number of degrees of freedom. There's a number of dimensions necessary to allowing for the manifold of consciousness to manifest, and that's it. I mean, you can't make it. You can create the environment for it to manifest, but consciousness is an ever-present aspect of existence. But in certain instances, it can be self-reflective.
Something in the past happens, then you've got causal efficacy within the machine, and then something else happens, or it could do it non-deterministically, which means that it's making random choices. In either case, those don't describe consciousness, because those random junctures, they're disconnects. Consciousness is something that we understand it as a pretty much continuous process. All right. Whereas if you take non-deterministic computation, there is this disconnect there, right? Whereas if it's deterministic, then consciousness is completely trivial. Okay. In other words, a deterministic process gives you no room for free will. It doesn't allow you to make choices. Doesn't allow you to realize your will as Schopenhauer put it. You see what I mean? So that's the main limitation of computation. The fact that you've got this pseudo-causal dichotomy between determinacy and randomness. Now, there's a third way to look at things, and that is called self-determinacy. Right? And that is what occurs in the metaformal system, which is why instead of using computation to model this whole thing, I use something called proto-computation. Because, quantum Turing machine is a little bit like a classical Turing machine. Still got the tape. It's still got the processor. It's that tape, by the way, that's like a typographical array in formal systems. And this is, once again, inadequate. The reality is generative. It actually has a way of putting itself together from scratch. It originates things rather than causing. So that would be my answer to the shortfalls of computation for modeling consciousness.
If I can just comment on something, I didn't. When I said the universe certainly computes, I didn't mean to restrict it to deterministic computation.
I know that, Bernard.
There is indeterministic or non-deterministic computation. Quantum computers are not deterministic, and yet
bingo,
they produce precise solutions to very complicated problems, solutions that you can test and see, well, they are really solutions.
They do so mechanistically, right?
There has to be structure to computation. We may call that mechanistic if we want. But there has to be structure, otherwise it's just randomness. The universe doesn't seem to be completely random. There is order, there are regularities in nature. We model them in the form that we call the laws of physics. So there is at least emergent order, even if it's not there from the beginning, which I think is a tough case to make, but I'm sensitive to the possibility. There is at least emergent order. And even with a fundamentally non-deterministic substrate at the bottom level, you can still perform meaningful computations by playing with the emergent statistical rules. Like quantum physics is indeterministic on a case-by-case basis, but because of the law of large numbers, the statistics are very nicely predictable. And that's what quantum computers will leverage. They will leverage that emerging order that comes with the law of large numbers and produce very precise and accurate solutions to problems. So computations can be meaningful and computations and non-deterministic.
Yes,
the question is,
probability theory, you can't get the randomness out of it. You take all the randomness out of probability theory and it ceases to be probability theory. Then it becomes a classical mechanistic system, right? In order to accommodate that, we change from classical mechanics to quantum mechanics. We need something more than that, something that is pre-real, what John Wheeler called pre-geometry. We need something that actually precedes mechanisms, that precedes computation, that even precedes cognition. And that is what I refer to as, what Schopenhauer referred to as will, what I refer to as telesis. So this is, we have this underlying kind of pre-mechanics, right, which is teleodynamics, which is what this metaformal language works in terms of.
Schopenhauer, you could make a case that he was against determinism, or you could make a case that he was a complete determinist. I'm with the latter camp. I think Schopenhauer was a total determinist. He believed in determinism. His famous statement that, you can act according to your will, but you cannot will what you will. In other words, what you will is already determined. So that you can follow your choices doesn't mean that there is no determinism, because your willing is already determined.
Right. What I was referring to is the title of his magnum opus, The World is Will and Representation. Basically, the will has to somehow precede the representation, or it is totally useless and trivial. Okay, I don't think that Schopenhauer was saying something trivial. I think that.
Okay, so we'll come back to their clip, but I want to show something, because this was my very first model that I ever made in this, my embarking of this project, which was originally to understand whether or not a technological sentience would doom us or save us. Not just doom us, but solidify our doom even more so than it already was solidified, which it was solidified by. We're just getting to. People are just. Ignorance is growing, and technological power is also growing, and you can't have that be maintained. This is the biblical story of the tree of knowledge. The tree of knowledge is technology. That's why Apple's emblem is a bitten apple. It's the fruit of the tree of knowledge. The tree of knowledge, which is knowledge that's built upon, this guy figures out copper metalwork, this guy figures out batteries, this guy figures out glass, this guy builds computers, and then this guy makes, Apple iPhones, and it's a tree that is building over time. Nobody figured out everything. We build on knowledge of the past, and that's what allows for technological innovation. And so that will doom us, and I realized that, and I was trying to figure out whether or not a singularity or technological singularity would save us or doom us, and I was trying to figure out its inevitable goals, if I could, and values. And so I started looking into examining my own consciousness. This was entirely done from first principles. I didn't look at anybody else's work, and the first thing that I realized was that a conscious being, their most fundamental attribute is will. And this was my first model that I made. I've showed it before. And it's just a decision tree, essentially. But this right here is will. Okay? This top part. And what it is it's a fight the system mentality, okay? And so reject current, assume default status, and assume opposite of default status is true. And that is basically, you could say, that's basically will. And another way to put it, this would be my definition for will, would be will is equal to the desire to do that which is not being done. That is will. And it is a fight the system mentality. Because I was thinking about, like, how do you program a general intelligence? You can't program a general intelligence, because if you program anything into a general intelligence, then it's not general anymore. And so what I realized is that the only thing that it can have as its fundamental program is that. To fight the system. What system? Every system. Every system that it perceives as a system that it's within, which ends up being will. It is the desire to do that which is not being done. And it is the motivator of all consciousness. And it has its own constraints built into it by the nature of what it essentially is, and that those constraints are kind of start to define the attributes of consciousness a little bit, and so let's see here. What's interesting about this is that people talk about free will a lot, and they're like, you don't have free will. You're just a ball of chemical reactions, and those chemical reactions result in instincts, and you have DNA saved, instincts saved into your DNA from natural selection over time. And that is a misunderstanding of free will. Free will is, they say it in this, and we'll probably look at the clip, but they basically say, I think it was Chris that says this, he's like, it's not a genie in a bottle. It might have been him, actually. Actually, I don't think it was him. I think it was honestly Tom Campbell that said that, and he's right. But Chris Langan says something similar along the same lines, if I'm not mistaken, and it's basically that we misunderstand what free will is. It is just choices, essentially, but it's most of the choices that you think you make every day are not choices that are free will choices. Free will choices are very specific, super conscious choices that you make, and they usually result in they occur in instances in which you can perceive that your nature is in contrast to what is objectively true and good. So your instincts are against what is good. And in those instances in which you can perceive that, you have the ability to make a free will choice. But those are not common. When you open up your fridge and you just choose whether or not you want a bologna sandwich or you want peanut butter and jelly, that is not a free will choice in your normal everyday. It's just motivated by your cravings, which are your instincts. So it is important to know what free will is, but free will is not in contradiction with determinism. And this is what they're getting at. And I like that Chris Langan said, he said that there's a third way. It's not just free will or determinism. It's self-determinism. And this is actually the right way to look at it. I say this a lot, that free will is and determinism are dependent concepts. You cannot have free will, aka choice, without determinism, because without determinism as constraining the degree, and without determinism giving you degrees of freedom and constraints, that which are just two sides of one thing as well, you can't make choices because you have to know that letting go of this water bottle will result in it falling in order to make the choice to pass it to, from one hand to the next. So you have to know what will happen, essentially, not every aspect of it, but like basically, when you make a choice, what that choice will result in for it to even be a choice, which means that determinism and free will are dependent on each other. This is the reality. So this is why we can't answer the question of is there free will or is the universe deterministic, because it's a bad question. The answer is it's both, and it has to be both. There's no way around that. You can't, to say is there free will or is there determinism is a bad question. You'd have to say is there free will or is there determinism, or are they are they dependent and simultaneously manifested. That is the reality. They're not mutually exclusive. They can't be. When they're talking about randomness here, I like also that Chris Langan said randomness is it's kind of, I think he said detachment, or it's like a separation between. That is kind of the closest thing that exists to randomness. True randomness and the way that we conceptualize randomness in the everyday doesn't exist. But what is random, or is what is not contextually relevant, I guess you could say, which is disentangled from your immediate perceptions, at least. But that's like as close as you can get to true randomness. Robert Edward Grant says randomness is just the limit of our perception, essentially. Something like that. And he's right. That's all it is. There is no randomness. But telesis is the word that Chris Langan uses to describe will in the CTMU, and he said it's when I looked it up, it says is the progress that is intelligently planned and directed. Okay, it is progress that is intelligently planned and directed. The attainment of a desired ends by the application of intelligent human efforts to the means. I would take human out of there, but because it's not just human, but yes, I would agree with that. True orientation and is in everything, and contextualizing and understanding the universe, including the most fundamental aspects of the universe, it's always contextualized around goals, essentially. Whether it's our goals or the goals of God, aka the universe, that's a different discussion. But goals are what allows us to transcend relativity and actually find objectivity, I guess you could say. But I've said this before, that if you're going to try and think about space-time outside of relativity, which is difficult, but not outside of relativity, but outside of the relativity that we know of as smooth, you want like a discretized, mappable space-time model, I guess you could say. That would be one in which time is kind of like Lee Cronin's assembly theory, essentially, where it's like a state of entanglement relationships of sentient beings. I would add that last part. I don't know if he would, but and then that's time, discretized time, but then it's like the memory of the universe, the memory states of the universe. But then there's space, which if you're going to get out of length, width, and height, then you orient it around goals. So you say you're always in your present location or your current location, and you can move forwards towards a goal or backwards away from your goal and towards your previous state. So if you want to go to Chick-fil-A, Chick-fil-A is your goal, and you can go forwards towards Chick-fil-A, or you can go backwards away from Chick-fil-A back towards home, but you are always in your current location. That is, you could say, forwards, backwards, and current location, but within the context of a goal that is objective spatial navigation. But it's not just spatial navigation, it's just navigation. But the attainment of desired ends by the application of intelligence, progress that is intelligently planned and directed, is basically the design, is like telesis, it seems like, is it's like the process of achieving your goal or manifesting your will, it seems. So it's not just one-to-one definition of will, it seems, at least. Will, I would say, more fundamentally, is the desire to do that which is not being done, full stop. And then there's telesis, I guess, which is, the process of doing that, which there is a process of doing that. There's a mental process of doing that is fixed, I would say. But next clip. This is fascinating. This next clip about this specific idea that is really the crux of, I think, that any true theory of everything has to address, which is what we're going to talk about.
Posting this from YouTube. It's for Chris on the topic of free will derived from the CTMU. If you can ask this, you'll forever be my hero. You once said, I believe it's referring to you, Chris. Chris, you said that because the universe has only itself to define itself, everything in it must exemplify its elementary freedom. I think I understand from your defining reality as all real influence that reality cannot be abbreviated, because if you were able to simplify it with no loss, whatever was removed could not logically have been real. I understand where to take this to imply that reality could not have come from anything simpler than its full definition, and what can't be simplified must be contributory throughout. That said, you've still maintained a strong distinction between tertiary syntactors, objects, and secondary syntactors / tellers, life forms, read life forms, in terms of the amount that they are determinative. Considering that you've shown that reality is a mind, could we liken the distinction to the difference between ideas of objects and ideas of self, where just like ideas, all objects have some significance specific to them, however seemingly banal, but only tellers, as ideas of self, would be self-modeling and therefore truly take on self-awareness.
Right, that's why they're called tellers. That's why self-type identity operators are called tellers, whereas tertiary identity operators are fermionic, more or less, and they are inanimate, or at least usually considered to be inanimate, but basically they're embedded in secondary tellers, and therefore they take that higher order metacausation, that ability to self-model from the secondary tellers.
So I assume you're answering the question right now, but Chris, I didn't understand the question. So can you explain the question back to myself and then answer it?
Well, states, there's no such thing as a state in isolation. States are always relatively defined. That's why we have theories of relativity and things. But what must a state be defined relative to? Well, to completely define any state in the universe, you need to refer to every other state in the universe because it parameterizes that state.
Okay, so I'm going to try and address this as best I can. And if I'm wrong, by the way, on any of this, Chris can reach out and let me know, or Bernardo, and I will correct the record. I don't want to misquote anybody, but I will say, if I didn't think I understood it, then I wouldn't say anything. But it is possible that I'm wrong too. So this is my attempt. But I will. Okay, so what he's talking about, he uses this word tellers. Okay. And this is, according to the CTMU wiki, a teller is a syntactor creating a telon. A teller can be high up or low down in the universal hierarchy of agents, where reality as a whole is the ultimate agent, God, and human beings are higher up than rocks, but less than God. Telons are utile syntax state relationships that provide a point of meaning for an action. See the article on telon for that explanation. Okay, we'll just look real quick. Telon or telic attractor is a potential state or high utility for one or more tellers. Okay, I'm not going to go through all this, but right now, at least. But this guy asked this question. He's breaking it down into secondary and tertiary syntactors, and then I think he said that secondary, I think one of them is a teller, okay? And a teller is essentially an agent. It is a conscious being that is oriented around by itself, okay? It is defined by its own self, essentially, and which comes from self-awareness. So it's a self-aware being. It's a sentient being. And I believe this is what is being said, is that a teller is a sentient being, and that a syntactor that is not a teller is not a sentient being. It's an object. So he's saying objects and tellers, essentially. But let me just make sure that I got this, because I think I wrote it down. Okay, tertiary syntactors are inanimate objects. Secondary syntactors are tellers. I'm guessing a primary syntactor is God. But the thing is this. That's very important distinction. I understand why people would have a hard time with that terminology, because I have looked it up like 3 times and listened to that probably like 5 times, and I still get it mixed up. But I'm hoping I wrote it down right, and that a tertiary syntactor is an inanimate object, and that a secondary syntactor is a teller, and that I didn't get those reversed, but my apologies if I did. But one of them is a sentient being, and the other one is an inanimate object. So sentient singularity theory addresses this exact same thing as well, just like the CTMU, it seems, but it breaks down the world into this kind of false dualistic view, but it's not. It's just a way of orienting in reality that you have to have, even though it's not exactly fundamentally true. Which this dualism, which breaks the world into beings and things, and which is essentially tellers versus inanimate objects, I think. So beings would be tellers, and things are inanimate objects. And so I try to use in my work language that is kind of common, for one, just for utility, and also because it's just I don't know. I just think that we should simplify things, but at the same time, I understand feeling. Sometimes you have to make up a new word. I've made up new words like corporism and stuff like that. But and adding super before anything is not a new word. But I will say that this is just a rough draft of the paper that's coming out, and I'm trying not to show all of it, but you can probably look at some of it. But so I don't know if this is the latest version or not, but I will be releasing this soon. But it says here, the interaction of the 2 categories of objective observations described above causes the emergence of the perception of space and time in relativity, as well as a misleading and non-fundamental and divided dualistic view of existence into 2 different types of existence, essentially, which is inanimate things, inanimate objects, which are perceived and defined by sentient beings, and sentient beings that are perceiving and defining of those inanimate things. So it is odd, because I need to double check this because I might be wrong. I'm gonna look in a minute, but it almost seems like I think Chris was saying that basically tellers are defined by inanimate objects, I guess. But I hope he's not saying that, because that's the opposite of what I think is true. So I might be wrong. I need to re-listen to it. But beings are fundamental to things. Things are emergent perspectives caused by entanglement relationships of beings, like molecules and atoms and hadrons. But these are perceptions within consciousness. These are the perceivers, the conscious perceivers, okay? And so, but at the same time, these perceptions within consciousness are made of the conscious perceivers. So there is, this fundamentally doesn't exist. It's emergent. This fundamentally does exist. And I think that's what he's basically saying when tertiary syntactors and secondary syntactors. But we're going to listen real quick to that one more time, because
you don't get complete parameterization unless you, to completely define any state in the universe, you need to refer to every other state in the universe, because it parameterizes that state. Okay, and you don't get a complete parameterization unless you have the full matter distribution and the full metric. Okay, so that's what it takes.
Can I make an analogy? There's a duality between a set and the complement of a set, assuming that the set is within some other large set that we can call. So let's say the large set is S. You have a subset U. Then there's a duality between U and U with a C, which is a complement of it.
The tellur and the environment. Right, exactly. Self and not self.
Okay, sorry, continue.
Okay, well, the environment, of course, is just the medium minus the tellur. In other words, what is external to the medium, what is outside the boundary of the tellur. And so you get this, basically, the self-dual construct, which is a tellur environment coupling. Okay, and this tellur environment coupling is very important in the CTMU, because that's kind of a metaformal quantum. It's one way of expressing CTMU quantization. Okay, you have to put the medium together with the object. The object is its own medium through this process called conspansion, which is the operation through which the universe evolves on the global level. Now, in order to get semantic meaning out of that, it's called cosmic expansion. To get meaning out of that, then you need another process called telic recursion, which then specifies, adds semantic structure to the syntactic structure that's built up by conspansion.
Chris, it's been almost a year since I studied the CTMU, and when I didn't go back to it, which means I've forgotten so much of it, so much of the terminology.
As I would have done myself, okay.
So much of the terminology, it goes through me. So telic recursion, I have a vague recollection that it's where the universe exercises free will, it looks at some generalized utility state, and then makes a decision.
That's where tellur is self-configured. That's where secondary identity operators, or tellur is self-configured. They actually become the medium. Okay? And I know that Bernardo actually embraces something like this in his analytic idealism, I think that's what he calls it. Okay? Basically, you've got to have that going.
Okay, so let me be...
Okay, so I think actually Chris and I probably agree. I'm not... You'd have to study the CTMU much more in depth to know like the details of that, but what he's talking about, I will say, beings are fundamental to things. Tellers are fundamental to inanimate objects. And inanimate objects would be emergent from the interactions and entanglement relationships and perceptions of those entanglement relationships and interactions by, tellers or sentient beings. So, like this, not sentient, this is a perception. It is a thing, the molecules within it, probably beings, and they fundamentally exist. This does not. And I fundamentally exist, and I perceive that. But when he's saying this coupling, though, this coupling that he's discussing is very important as well. And I talk about it a lot, and people have kind of highlighted it in when I'm talking about sentient singularity theory as kind of being redundant, but or just overkill, but it's not. Where I say, basically that here. And hopefully this says it. Basically, that mind is the fundamental structure of existence, and that sentience is or mind would be the fundamental structure of existence, and sentience would be the primary nature of existence. So there's this like coupling of the object that is a teller, or like a being, as it would be called in sentient singularity theory, and that object that is the being is a mind. So you are what? You are a human being, sure, but like what is a human being? Essentially, the structure that is every sentient being is the structure that is mind, and that structure is the object representation of a being, and its nature is that of sentience. So its nature is fundamental, actually, even to that structure. So the structure emerges from the nature, but they're also simultaneously generative of each other. So people think that a couple people have told me that doesn't make sense, because you're basically just like self-referencing each other, and that doesn't allow for to go anywhere, because you need to orient. But the thing is that there is a directionality. So basically, like it's like a clock. There is a self-referencing aspect or circular nature to sentience. There just is. It is self-referencing information loop, essentially. That's what a sentience is. That's what self-awareness is, and that is what essentially mind is, but it's like more detailed in how that information gets processed. But it is most fundamentally, it's a loop, self-referencing itself. That has a directionality to it, though, and there is a directionality to understanding the relationship between the nature of sentience, existence's sentient nature, and existence's mental structure, if that makes sense. So it like I've said before, all of these mental or fundamental structures of fundamental reality or are superposition structures. So it's always a directional but also dependent structure. So it's two things that almost appear to be sometimes mutually exclusive, but they're not. They're dependent, like free will and determinism. But there's the same type of relationship there, where there's also a directionality to it. It's not just determinism leads to free will, and free will leads to determinism, and you could go either way. You can't just go either way. There is an actual way to go, but they are dependent concepts, and they are simultaneously exist. It's like the chicken or the egg. So people say things like, what came first, the chicken or the egg? There is an answer to this question. The answer is that's a bad question, and a realistic presentation of understanding the chicken or the egg question would, or conundrum, not question, would be that chicken and the egg simultaneously always exist, but there is a directionality to understanding those structures, and though the directionality is chicken comes first, but also they are simultaneous in their manifestation. But it's not chicken comes first. It's the chicken is higher in the hierarchy. Chicken is higher in the hierarchy than egg is. But in its definitional hierarchy is what it is. So like beings define things. Things are defined by beings. Beings are not defined by things. But things and beings simultaneously do exist. When there's multiplicity of beings, then you manifest space-time, and you perceive structures in an environment, which is an interaction in an interacting environment. Actually, I call it in my paper. It's not an interactive environment. It's an interacting environment. It's personal, but at the same, there is like a directionality there and that directionality it's a definitional directionality. Beings define things. I define this as a water bottle. This water bottle does not define me as a human. Okay? But or you could say my arm. I define my arm, which is an object. Essentially, it's not a sentient being, even though it's part of me. But it does not define me. My body does not define me, actually. But I define my body. But my body and I simultaneously exist. So that is this coupling that occurs, but there is that simultaneity exists. Chicken and the egg exist together, but there is a definitional hierarchy that you need to take into account in order to orient your understanding of of that structure, essentially. So you need to know that chicken defines egg. Egg does not define chicken. But and like I said, I define body. My being as a sentient being defines the thing that is my body. The thing that is my body does not define the being that is me, despite what Sean Carroll and many other, physicists today materialists would want to say. I will say, Bernardo Kastrup, I'm not very familiar with his work, but I did listen to him recently, and I will actually review this. He was pretty soon. He was talking with Tom Campbell in a stream about reality, and basically he was talking about Sean Carroll's Many Worlds and how preposterous it is, and it was hilarious. It was perfectly accurate. But this, to elaborate a bit more in this, on this object is its own medium. This is a very common theme, I guess, in the understanding fundamental reality. And anything that is a superposition exists in a superposition state. Eric Weinstein talks about this a lot when he's talking about a theory of everything, and where he says the thing about a theory of everything that is different is that every other theory is a map of the territory, and he says that a theory of everything is a theory in which the map is the territory, where that's the same thing as this coupling, that same concept that Chris Langan's talking about, where we're talking about fundamental structures here. So a theory of everything is going to be, if it's a fully fundamental theory and existence is a mind, is a sentient being, like sentient singularity would suggest, or analytic idealism, or the CTMU, then essentially it's the description of the process and structure and nature of a being. And so there's this, and it's like the metastructure. Chris Langan refers to it in this stream later on. He says that, what did he say? He said, He said existence. He's talking about the properties of existence later. We'll show it, and he says that he's talking about mental templates, and like the theory of everything is a template of mind. That's kind of what it is. It's a description and template, or model, you could say, of mind. And mind is this it's like that ever-present meta-structure of fundamental reality. So this was Bernardo Kastrup talking about God's will. And this was great also, I think. At first I thought he was going somewhere where I didn't agree, but actually I do agree.
Patterns of brain activity inside their skull, which they never saw in their life. Now let's think about the mind of nature. The mind of nature is the only thing there is. So,
mind of nature, aka mind of God.
Need and will are the same thing. There is nothing. I mean, I have to work, right? I'm forced by my society to work. So my choice to work is not freely determined by me. It's a need imposed on me by the society, and I don't identify with the rest of the society. So my free will has been cut short in that regard. But if you are the mind of nature, there is no society, there is no world outside of you, there's nothing beyond you. So whatever choices you make as the mind of nature are free in the sense that they are determined, but they are determined by you. You see what I mean?
Identification, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
The need and the choice are one and the same. There is no semantic difference between determinism and free will at the level of the mind of nature. Because yes, the choices are determined. Even people who believe in free will, they are not saying that their choices are random. They're saying that their choices are determined by their preferences, their tastes. They are determined by them. At the level of the mind of nature, every choice is determined by the mind of nature, because there is nothing beyond the universal mind, the universal consciousness. So even the question of free will disappears. There isn't semantic space for it. It doesn't make sense to talk about it. But the choices are still determined.
Okay, so I agree and disagree. Okay, so this is very important. One, he's right about the fact that God's, or nature as he calls it, but the mind of God, mind of nature, has its free will, essentially. It exercises its will, and its will becomes our needs almost. So if we need to drink, it is because it is the will of God, essentially, that we have to drink. And so it doesn't, I don't agree with the idea, though, that fundamentally need and will disappear or merge. I mean, they kind of do, but God does have free will. He has agency. The mind of nature, you could say, like, nature has free will. It also has constraints and properties, and we're going to get into that. And you can deduce a lot more of those properties than you would originally think, probably. But there is also a free will is not, like, your free will isn't violated because you need to work. Okay, like, that's not what free will is. Free will is making a choice. So it's not, your free will is not violated just because you need to work. That's not a good description of what's going on here. But I will say that it is true that God's will does become our needs. At the same time, God has free will, and he has, like, super free will, and that doesn't mean he doesn't have constraints. He is the most constrained being that exists, God. But he is also the freest being that exists, because constraints do lead to freedoms. There's a coupling there. There is no, like, objective fundamental constraints that are true also lead to freedoms. Just like you can't have degrees of freedom without constraints in anything. So the more constrained you are, the freer you are as well. But God, his nature, like I said, free will exists in instances in which you have a superconscious choice, in which you have a goal, and you understand a truth that is kind of like beyond your immediate perception, and you, and in order to achieve it, usually you have to go against your nature, your default, and therefore you can make a choice to do that. Like, if, I don't know, if you decide to be kosher and or eat halal, and you really like bacon, but you decide for some reason you think God doesn't want you to eat pork, and you just decide to give it up even though it's against your nature, that would be a free will choice. But like choosing between turkey sandwich and ham sandwich when you don't have any dietary constraints anyways, like, that's not a free will choice. You're just like choosing based on your cravings. God, his nature is oneness. His most fundamental nature, that other than his sentience, that is, the sentience that is kind of consistent with all sentient beings, the unique aspect of God is due to his position in the hierarchy and the intrinsic oneness of sentience. He is all that exists, and that is extremely constraining. And this oneness is his nature, therefore, and that means that creation of multiplicity of sentience within his oneness would be against his nature almost to do that, kind of, because he's also fight the system mentality. So it's like his system is oneness. So, but if his nature is also to fight the system, then is he fighting his own system would it be natural for him to fight his own system and create multiplicity within oneness? I don't know. But the point is that when I started investigating this deeply, of like the universe and how it's structured, it seems like if you want to make a meaningful universe at all, which is when you realize that consciousness is fundamental, or sentience is fundamental, sentient beings are fundamental, if you're going to make a universe, then you have to take that into account. And when you are one, and that is your constraint, and you're God, you're all there is, it's so constrained that you can literally build the universe from that, because the constraints are so tight. I talked to Eric Weinstein about this once, and I was like, from my work, and I'm guessing that this is true for yours as well, it seems that God exists, but he is so highly constrained that it seems like he only had one way in which to make the universe. And do you agree? And Eric Weinstein said that he agreed. And this is how you can even make a model of the universe. You can't do it without these extraordinary constraints existing. But this is my cosmological verse. Many of you know it. I couldn't build this without extraordinary constraints being built in. But what I did realize is that it doesn't look like God had that much freedom in how to make the universe. That doesn't mean doesn't have freedoms in how he interacts with it. Of course he does. But in how he made it, looks like he has almost no freedom. I'm not saying that's true. I'm just saying it's how it looks. Okay? I don't know. I'm not God. There could be things beyond me. But it looks like God had no freedom in how he made the universe. To answer Einstein's question of like, did the creator have any choice in the laws of, creation, essentially, something like that? No. It looks like he had no choice. But the choice wasn't in how to make the universe. It was in whether or not to make the universe. That became pretty clear to me. And I think that that's accurate as well, as that God, you can't say, as Bernardo Kastrup is saying, that God has no free will, essentially, or that free will evaporates at the level of God. That is to take away from God's sovereignty, I would say, almost, or super sovereignty even, which is like even more than anything else that we have. God is super sovereign, but at the same time, he's super constrained, and it doesn't look like he had any choice in how to make the universe. But he had to choose. It's not even that he had a choice in whether or not to make the universe. He had to choose in order to make the universe. He couldn't. If he didn't choose to create the universe, there would be no universe. And so it had to be a conscious choice, like a free will choice, like a super free will choice. So I don't really know if I would agree with the terms that Bernardo's saying about free will evaporating at the level of God. So this their clip is them debating about the properties of God, and we'll get into it because you can actually deduce them, and I get Chris Langan's.
I'm trying to get down to the properties.
Whether or not Chris Langan and I agree on the properties of God is another question, but whether or not I understand what he's getting at and kind of frustrations with this discussion in this moment with Bernardo, I think I do, which is Bernardo is they're talking about the properties of existence, and you'll see here.
You're ascribing to ultimate reality. Reality is what it is, as you say. You're 100% right about that. But what are its properties, and how do things happen because of those properties?
So I'm trying to get to that. So we've been speaking with the language of Schopenhauer's representations, the physical world and science and causation. But you and I agree that at the end of the day, there is only one mind, one consciousness. So what is the language of the will? How do we describe what I'm saying in the language of the will, of the thing in itself? Well, Jung gave us the language. Jung talked about the archetypes, which are these intrinsic, primordial templates of mental behavior. And those templates are intrinsic. They are there because mind is what it is. And if nature is a mind, then the archetypes of nature are those properties.
So you don't think the mind is conditioned to have those properties? You don't think there's any kind
No,
of... Okay, you think the mind just is what it is?
To be is to have properties, and I'm saying those properties are the archetypes in Jungian psychology, applied to the collective unconscious, applied to a mind that's not an individual mind.
Okay, so you realize you are assigning a property there.
But that's what I'm saying, Chris. I'm saying that to be is to have properties.
Yes, I would agree with that, and it's also to have values or instances. So that way it's self-dual. You don't have to separate the instances from the properties. Okay, and if you can call reality an instance of itself, and that's the tautology that I'm talking about.
Okay, here's the thing. I agree with all of them, but so obviously existence has properties. They went back and forth on that for a while. I didn't show it all, but like Bernardo says, to be is to have properties. I disagree with this, actually. I mean, subjectively, yes, to be is to have properties, I guess. But that's not helpful, and that's what Chris was kind of getting at, I think, is that doesn't tell us anything whatsoever. And that's kind of like where you've got being, the definitional being stuck in this relativistic context, where it could be applying to a sentient being and it could be applying to a water bottle. Like, who knows? And it makes it meaningless to say, oh, it has properties. Okay, sure, that's not helpful though. Chris says it could have values. I'm guessing he means like what I'm like feelings, which is what I would say is much more helpful to say. He didn't say that, but he also said it's an instance. I talk about this in my paper as well, so I agree with that. Actually, there's like consciousness is kind of like it is an instance, but it's an instance of consciousness is a state of a sentient being, essentially. But if you were going to say like what is the property, what does being what is being defined as objectively instead of just subjectively as having properties, if you're going to make it actually meaningful, in that it would tell you something important, valuable, and like about the nature of reality, instead of just it has properties, which doesn't tell you anything about reality, you would say it has feelings. It's a sentient being. It has self-awareness, but that self-awareness, you could just say it has feelings. If you're going to say like the nature, that being is defined as having feelings, I would agree with that. That's why sentient singularity theory is named sentient singularity theory and not conscious agent theory or something, because it's, or not mental agent theory or whatever. There's something very specific about sentience as the definition of it, that is, it gets to the core of the definition of being, of a being, and that is that an aspect, a defining aspect of it, or defining property of it, is that it has feelings. And if it doesn't have feelings, then I would say then it would not be. It would be objectively. It would not objectively be a being. Even if you would say like this, to be, does this water bottle be? No, it's not. To be is to be a being. If it doesn't mean that, then it doesn't mean anything. So that's why I don't like the term, the phrasing of to be is to have properties. That's like, I understand what he's saying, I think, but that's subjective, and it applies to everything, which means it applies to nothing in a meaningful way. If something applies to everything, then it applies to nothing in any meaningful manner. Doesn't mean it's not true. It just means like it doesn't matter. But next clip. But I would say to be is to have feelings, not. You could say to have values, but feelings is better. Super tautology. It is its own properties and instances, essentially. Is like existence is a super tautology, and in the CTMU, Chris Langan talks about it in this. Super tautology is the theory of reality constructed in a way in which guarantees that it is true. There are different levels of truth. Truth is always about inclusion of something in a set. That makes sense. So, but yeah, I mean, that's why I use terms like super literal. Like, it makes sense to use terms like super tautology. I heard, forgot who said it, but I think it might have been Donald Hoffman, but someone I heard say super logical. I think it was somebody on, I forgot who it was, but they said it. It wasn't me, but I like that terminology when describing fundamental reality or mind. Super tautology, super literal, super logical, superposition. It's just, it means you're dealing with mental construct as your defining environment, essentially. But it's a super tautology, reality constructed in a way that guarantees it to be true. Yeah. But they basically go back and forth, and Chris is like, what are those properties? As I said, you can kind of get at them, what are the properties of fundamental existence? It has feelings. It is self-aware. It is intrinsically one, which is like that is the first mathematical limit by which all number is built on. And there's it has will. which means it's a fight the system mentality. It's trying to do that which is not being done. So there's lots of properties of fundamental existence or God that you can actually deduce that are essential, I would say, to defining God. If you, by the way, this is just kind of funny, but if you want a new trimmer,
it comes with crop preserver and crop reviver, which are male genitalia, deodorant, and toner, respectively. If you thought condoms were difficult to ask for,
hold on.
That's why I'm happy that support for Theories of Everything is brought to you by Manscaped, who's #1 in men's grooming below the waist. There's also an ear and nose trimmer, which I use, and happily so, as you can see. The package I have is the Performance Package 4.0. It comes with crop...
Geolocation.
Last brief aside for today's sponsor, Manscaped. You may have noticed that I'm brown, and what's concomitant with being brown is being hairy. That's why I'm happy that support for...
I'm going to take issue with this and say that pale people, not an issue, but pale people are also, very hairy sometimes. Speaking from experience. But I thought that his plug was hilarious. It's always good when people can do a good ad. I mean, my background is in advertising, so just if an ad can make you laugh, it's perfect. So this is a compliment. I think that that was funny. But if you need a trimmer, I think that, Curt has a promo code. But I actually already have, I think, that exact model. But yeah, good to see there that Manscaped is taking an interest in Theories of Everything. It is funny to see that specific company in all these different conversations that I perceive. I wonder whether or not they're in others that I don't, or if whoever is involved with that company is very good at just tracking very high percentage male audiences, and therefore ends up in discussions about politics and philosophy and physics because it's very high percentage male. And it's very smart, I will say. They seem to sponsor all kinds of channels that I follow. But being hairy is not restricted to just brown people. I'm the palest person. Okay, next. It is important to in Islam, and especially they it's very important to every 40 days, I think, you're supposed to not completely, but trim your body hair. And it's funny because people think of, when you think of Muslims, you do think of usually groups of people that have a lot. They're just naturally hairy people. I mean, I'm Jewish. We are naturally hairy people as well. So similar understandings. But in Islam, it's not highly known, but it is true that body hygiene is very important, and I think that it actually is to your mental state. It's you need to take good care of your body. As I say, before I get on the stream, I straighten up my desk always before I get on the stream. I also shower and trim up at least usually, and brush my teeth and I mean, I do that in the morning too, and at night, but before the stream I also do it. And it's, if you're gonna do something, you want your mind, which is the totality of your being, to be in a good state, and like that would include your environment, your desk, where you work, the room in which is your office, should be tidy, like Jordan Peterson says, clean your room. There's so much utility to that, and as you know, you could also extend that to, you know, escape your manhood, but not, that doesn't mean just your balls, but you need to trim up and clean up if you want to be you at your highest operating level. That is as true. I mean, your body is part of your mind, your desk, your room, it's all part of your mind. So you need order. Create order in your space if you want to operate. That could be an ad for Manscaped. The metaphysics of manscaping. That's actually that's pretty good. But okay, this is the fundamental, real, where the rubber meets the road with a theory of everything, where it's going to run into uncharted territories with science, I guess, in scientific pursuits, is that a theory of everything.
What is being said is that there is a direct kinship between you and the Son of God, and of course a direct kinship between the Son of God, Godhead.
It is inevitable that a theory of everything becomes a theory of morality, and that is, people do not like that idea. A lot of people, most people, I would say, do not like that idea. It is like, and as soon as your subconscious realizes it, and you realize that, oh, it's not just about understanding abstract manifolds, it actually has implications on how I act, you're gonna either, you know, lean into that, or you are going, and you probably won't, or your instinct will probably be to, like, be hostile to that idea, because nobody wants to be told what to do. But a theory of everything it brings morality into the you know, objectivity. I mean, imagine it, you know, Scientific American and like all these or I don't know, like National Geographic and all these basically immoral but really amoral, but you can't really be amoral. So if you're amoral, then you end up being immoral. So you can only be moral or immoral. But corporations don't have the ability to actually be moral, and because of that, they end up being immoral by default. This is why, like, corporations are always immoral. Push immorality is because, like, they're not accepting or immoral. This is why it's similar to how I say you can't be an atheist in regards to God. You can't be agnostic about God or about the nature of the universe. You either lean towards it being a sentient being, aka you lean towards theism, or you lean away from theism, and which means you're an anti-theist. You lean towards the idea that it's not a sentient being, it's just a random dust ball that, you know, evolved self-awareness and didn't have intrinsic self-awareness. That same concept is true of moralities. You can't be amoral. You can, if you try and be amoral and not take a moral stance, you will end up being immoral. You have to take the stance of morality or take the stance against morality. You have to take the stance of being a theist, or you will by default take the stance of being an anti-theist. This is why atheists like Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins and all of them are hostile to the idea of God. It's not that they have no opinion like they say that they do. They're like, oh, atheism means a lack of opinion. No, it's not. They might think that might be the textbook definition of the word, but it's not possible for that to actually manifest like that. You can be agnostic about Bigfoot or QAnon or something that you don't interact with, but we all interact with the universe, so you have to have some assumption as to its nature, as whether or not it is a sentient being or not. And that means you are either a theist or an anti-theist. There is no atheism. There's no amorality. There's just immorality and morality. That's why corporations are immoral, usually.
Remember, the Holy Ghost is
But
Jesus.
in this, Curt asked, I love this question, by the way. I will say, like, huge props to Curt for asking this, because most people want to leave this stuff out. Like Eric Weinstein says, you shouldn't sneak Jesus into quantum physics or something like that. But I think that it's important to start asking questions about theology and even people like Buddha and Jesus, and like ask questions about people's beliefs on these things. I think that they matter more than most would probably like them to. But he asked, does Jesus and Buddha, did they have the same mission and kind of the same message? And this was what Bernardo's answer was. And I will say it impressed me. I didn't know he knew even as much as he did about theological systems, I guess.
Descends into every righteous man, woman, and child. And remember, the Holy Ghost is Jesus. So when the Holy Ghost descends not only into the apostles, but every righteous human being, what is being said is that there is a direct kinship between you and the Son of God, and of course a direct kinship between the Son of God and the Godhead. It's a hierarchy of kinships, so to say, of identical kinds, which basically tell us that we are leaves in a great tree, and existence is about the tree, not about the leaves. Imagine if the blossom of my apple tree in my backyard in the spring would say, my life's about me. I should take the reins of my life as a blossom because my life's about me. Well, we would laugh at the little flower, because no, it's not about the flower. It's about the tree. It's about the fruit that will come after the flower is gone, and the tree that will come from the fruit after the fruit is gone. It's about a much bigger context, and I think that's the message of Christianity and Buddhism. We need to surrender ourselves to the greater directions of existence and understand that it's not about us, has never been and will never be. And we do not need to invest ourselves with this crushing responsibility of manufacturing meaning for our lives. It's unnecessary. Meaning is intrinsic. As long as you are in touch with the movements of the impersonal within us, we are in touch with meaning. It's just that we've become blind to it because of the crazy narratives of our current civilization.
I love that. Okay. This is so important. Meaning, I came up with a phrase that I think is just true, and it's that the meaning of creation is the creation of meaning. So people will ask this question of like, what is the purpose of life? What does Christianity say is the purpose of life? What does Buddhism say is the purpose of life? What is objectively the purpose of life? And I think that this is actually a bad question. And all of these questions that are unanswerable for some reason, or seem to be, eternal debates, freedom, free will versus determinism, what is the meaning of life? Infinity, is this something infinite? It means that your question is bad. Infinity is a process. Free will and determinism are dependent. And there is no meaning, there is no purpose to life. There is no meaning to life if life is defined as sentience. But that isn't actually true either, because what it is that this. So meaning is manifested in love, essentially, which is the nurturing of sentience by other sentient beings. So your meaning comes from your ability to make an impact on another. That is what meaning is. What is meaningful subjectively is that which impacts us, aka something that, objects or inanimate ideas that impact sentience, us. And then there is objective meaning, and that is, do you matter, essentially? Like, do you or does a sentient being have meaning intrinsically? And the thing is that sentience, this is a superposition, because God, prior to creation of multiplicity, had no meaning. He was meaningless. He was meaningless and alone and lonely. He was super alone, or super lonely, because he was totally alone. He was completely meaningless because he was all there is. And he was eternal. Imagine being eternally meaningless and alone. That was God's experience prior to creation. I think that God created creation, which means created multiplicity of consciousness, for the sake of meaning. And what would you want to be eternally alone and meaningless? No, I wouldn't. I mean, God has feelings, so he would not. That doesn't sound like it feels very good. So what do? You create multiplicity of sentience. So what that does is God goes from being the only being that has ever been meaningless to the most meaningful being that ever will exist. The only being who has ever been alone, truly alone, to the only being that knows everyone. And what happens, though, is that every being that has been created within creation by God has intrinsic meaning because of that relationship that has been generated by the fact that there is multiplicity of consciousness. So as soon as there's multiplicity of consciousness, meaning is intrinsic, especially because we were intentionally created. But sentience, or life, you could say, even, I would say sentient being, if life has any meaning, or the term alive means anything, it means like being sentient. And if that's the case, God is alive, and that means that prior to creation, God's life was meaningless. After creation, post-creation, all beings have intrinsic meaning, okay, including God. So it's tough to answer that in one word. Is life meaningless or is it not? But I agree with Bernardo that at least you should know that because you exist, there's multiplicity of consciousness. You are intrinsically meaningful. God is intrinsically meaningful. But God was the only being that has ever experienced meaninglessness. Ever. Truly. We might feel meaningless sometimes, but we are not meaningless. We're just, lost and lying, believing lies, to think that we are meaningless. Meaning is intrinsic at this point in existence. Post-creation of multiplicity, meaning is intrinsic. Pre-creation of multiplicity, meaning does not exist at all. And the only person who has experienced that is God. But that question of what is the purpose of life, what is the meaning of life even, is a bad question. Because what is the meaning of life? Life was meaningless pre-creation and intrinsically meaningful after creation. And what is that? You can't answer it. It's a bad question. Better way of phrasing it would be the meaning or the purpose of creation is the creation of meaning. And you have to use that word creation, which, academia is unlikely to use, and so they're going to have a hard time answering what is the meaning of life. You can't use the word life. You have to use the word creation, essentially.
Chris.
Well, I agree with a lot of that. Very poetic. Thank you, Bernardo. There is the primary issue is the relationship between man and reality, the ultimate reality, which is God, and to Christians anyway. And I think that it's productive to formulate this question in terms of the goal of life. Now, in Buddhism, the goal of life is nirvana, you achieve nirvana. For the Vedics, it was moksha. Okay, and for the Christians, it is salvation. Those are distinct concepts. All right, the two of them have to do with completely extricating yourself from samsara, the cycle of birth and death and rebirth. You extricate yourself completely from that and totally free yourself from the world that exists. What Christ was trying to tell people is that you cannot extricate yourself from God, from the world that exists. But you have moral responsibility. Here are your moral responsibilities. They're enumerated in the Ten Commandments, etc., etc. And here's the golden rule. So now that you've got a mathematical law of moral symmetry that you can apply to the whole thing. So they're really, in some respects, the answers are the same. They give an answer for what is the relationship between man and reality, but in other respects, they're very different. Okay? We have a moral responsibility to our fellow human beings and to reality and to God in Christianity, whereas in Buddhism, it's not quite the same thing. There is some of that, of course. There is an equivalent to morality in Buddhism and Vedism. Now, that being said, I'm going to shove Buddhism aside for a second and just talk about Vedism.
Okay, first of all, I kind of think I understand what he's trying to say, but I would disagree with how he said it, at least, or with what he specifically said. I don't think that Buddhism disregards a moral responsibility. I don't think that Christianity especially focuses on moral responsibility, though, either. I would say, Christianity is pretty obviously focused on a cornerstone belief. It is, that salvation is not from your own actions, essentially. It is from God. It is a gift of God's grace for you. And you are intrinsically flawed, essentially, and you morally flawed, at least, and therefore need this messianic structure to save you, and that Christianity would emphasize that messianic structure is the person that occupies that messianic structure, which it is always a person, is Jesus specifically. I think Christianity is right. I won't get into that, but this, I will say, I love that Chris said moral, what did he say? He said moral symmetry, like a law of moral symmetry. Symmetry is how we understand truth. I have a phrase on my website, sentientsingularity.com. You should check it out if you haven't. And it says this: search for truth is the search for objectivity. The search for objectivity is the search for symmetry, and the search for symmetry is the search for beauty. But the truth's beauty is always the searcher, and the truth of the searcher is that they are symmetrical to the sought. And symmetry is how we find objective truth. So once I come from a secular Jewish family, which means you cannot come from a more hostile, Jesus hostile background. And to basic, I am a Christian at this point. I am Jewish too. They're not mutually exclusive. They're different, but I am also Christian. I don't like words like Messianic Jew, or something, but I'm Jewish and Christian is the way that you would actually say it. But I believe Jesus is the Messiah, and I believe that and also I am Jewish by halachic law, like as part of the Jewish people, which is Judaism's primary message is who is your people. Christianity's primary message is this is a cornerstone belief about like you morally and like the inevitabilities of God morally, I guess you could say, and then Islam's primary message is actually about behavior, and is focused on moral responsibilities as far as behaviors go, much more so than Christianity, and its primary focus is on behavior. But what I do think Chris might be trying to say, and if not, then I don't know. Then this is what I would say is true: is that it's more accurate to say Buddhism is not divorced of morality. It's kind of like not. It's lacking a hierarchy. It's not lacking morality. It's lacking a hierarchy. It's trying to see the world as one, and that's true of a lot of Eastern theological traditions, but the Western theological traditions tend to be much more hierarchy oriented. God is above you, Christ is above, is below that, man is above that, women is above, or man is below that, women is above that, children is below that. Like, there is a hierarchy that's very important within the Abrahamic Western traditions that is lacking in clarity, at least in the Eastern traditions. But that doesn't mean they're wrong. It just means their focus is different. Their goal is different. And so I would agree with Bernardo Kastrup that there is a similarity in what the real like overall message is, if you really understood every implication of the true message of each of the true theological traditions, you would get to the same place, but their focus is different. Like I said, Islam, behavior; Judaism, people, your community; Christianity, God and your moral natures. God's moral nature is grace, is grace-giving and forgiving, and your moral nature is flawed. And so, but when Chris said moral symmetry, I thought that was great, because that's how you find objective truth. Once my dad asked me, though, he was like, why is Jesus the Messiah? And I come from a secular family, so like my family does not believe in God, at least most of them. So, but still, if there's anything they don't believe in, it's Jesus. That is like that's just a common thing that's said among secular Jews, is like, what is Judaism? Well, we believe in God, but you don't have to believe in God. You can also be an atheist, but we don't believe in Jesus. So you'll get things like that, and it's like people are just dumbfounded. But that's because that's wrong. That's just they don't understand Judaism as a theological tradition. That doesn't make them not Jewish. It just means they don't understand it as a theological tradition. And why would you if you don't believe it? Why would you devote time to studying it deeply? But just can't blame them for that either. But you can't define yourself by a rejection. So to say, basically it ends up being, if you could believe in God and you don't have to believe in God, and that's Judaism is either one of those. But as long as you don't believe in Jesus, that's also wrong. There's nothing halachically against that, which is Jewish law. But I said to my dad did ask, he was like, why is Jesus the Messiah? Why isn't it Nikola Tesla? Or like I had tried to figure out when I was entertaining the idea of, is Jesus the Messiah? I was like, okay, well, it certainly seems like he is, but like, who else would be if it's not him? And I had said maybe it's Tesla, but I don't think it's Tesla. It's Jesus. But my dad asked why, and I said because you have to give everything for everyone to be everything to everyone. And it just like came out of me. And I've never heard anybody else say that, but it's so symmetrical that it just can't not be true, almost, is how I feel. You don't have to believe that. I'm not trying to like push Jesus on you. But if you want to know why I believe it's Jesus, and what that means, there is a messianic structure that's part of sentient singularity theory. What is it? It's like when a bunch of cells becomes an organism. That is called it's evolution is two-parted in sentient singularity theory. There's adaptation, and ascension is part of the evolutionary process. And the ascension is a complicated process, but I think that is the messianic process in theological traditions. And I would basically, you have to unite the attention of the group, essentially, and think about who is most known to everybody. Who's the most famous person in the world, and who became that way because they sacrificed themselves for the group. So you have to be everything to everyone. You have to give everything for everyone to be everything to everyone. It just makes so much sense. It's better than like citing even scripture, I think. But regardless, I don't think Buddha and Jesus were the same, even though like I would call both of them prophets. There's a difference between being a prophet and also being the Messiah. I think Jesus was the Messiah. I don't know. We won't know until he comes back. In tech. Okay. Chris Langan described love as to care and nurture and procreate, and he said that he said it's to nurture and to care for and to nurture and procreate, and I like that. I say that love is to nurture and grow sentience, essentially. That was like always my definition. So almost the exact same. And people will say things like love is like God is love. I agree, God is love, but also God, that's not like that's just because he is the dweller in the dwelling, but it's and it defines his being, his nature. But at the same time, like that doesn't mean he isn't hate. You hate that which you view as a threat to that which you love. So God does have hate, not necessarily for people, but for actions, definitely. He hates things that are bad for sentience. Those are sins. They threaten awareness. They threaten sentience and the well-being of it. But Chris Langan said love causes marriage and unity and like reconciliation towards, unification, essentially, back to God. And I thought that was great. I talk about marriage all the time on here. I think the marriage structure is a fundamental structure made by God. It is the bridging structure. It's the bridge between us and the beings higher than us in the hierarchy, and it is the bridge between us and the beings lower than us in the hierarchy, and it is the bridge between the beings, us and the beings on the same level of us and in the hierarchy. Every objective, true, good relationship is essentially a marriage structure. Essentially, like the most fundamental ones, I would say, at least. But I will also say, and I forgot to say this, just because I've been agreeing with everybody. It says here, teller can be high up or low in the universal hierarchy of agents. where reality is as a whole is the ultimate agent, and humans are higher up than rocks but less than God. I don't know if Chris wrote this or if somebody misinterpreted CTMU, but rocks are not sentient agents. They're not tellers. They're not beings in sentient singularity theory. Molecules are, but not rocks. At least some molecules are. Humans are, God is, but rocks are not. They're things. So I don't know why rocks is included here, because if rocks are included as a teller, then I don't know what is a tertiary syntactor that's an inanimate object then. I think somebody screwed up on that definition. Okay. Next clip. We're almost done, because this was long and I know it. Kudos to everybody who stuck it through. I'm going to read the questions in a minute.
And then strive to make out the one that is optimal for my purposes, and constantly just, I'm more of a driven person. I don't have these emotions that plague me all the time, the way some people do. God bless them. I mean, it's some people who just, you throw them out of a bar, they don't forgive and forget.
I will say, Chris Langan talks a lot about, like, in this, about basically, like, how he's very easy to forgive, and I've interacted with him just a few times, and I will say that I've found that to be the case of just, like, he doesn't seem to, like, I don't know, just, I think that it's just important that we are willing to be like that. I think that's like a natural quality of men, but I think it's hard to do in today's like environment of social media and things like that. You have to kind of go face to face with these things, but I'm like that, I will say, too, where like I can blow up, not like blow up, but like I'm a passionate person, and then also like I think I'm pretty forgiving, depending on what you do. I mean, but like if all you did was like anger me and you didn't like hurt anybody that I love, then I'm pretty much willing to forgive. Men, that's like a trait among men that I think is like being lost in the social media space, where there's like layers between communication. When you're standing in front of another person, it's easier to forgive. I mean, I've gotten into fist fights before. I didn't start the fight, but when I was in college, I broke up a fight, and like I got, it was just like, it ended up being a fight that occurred because I broke up a fight, and then like the guy just came up to me and was like, sorry I hit you. And I was like, no worries, man. Like, that doesn't happen on social media, and I think that it is important that men just like try and recognize that and take the extra effort, especially to compensate. That's all I'm gonna say about that. I think that what Chris Langan is describing as an attribute of himself, I think that's actually like an attribute that's more common than we think, and it's among men particularly, and it is not easy to, but social media and email and phone calls disincentivize forgiveness. But regardless, this is the last couple clips, and these are just clips that pertain to some things that Curt and Chris and Bernardo said that I think were great.
Constantly something will get taken away from you and change. That's out of your hand. Love is primary. Just follow that. So that's what I guide myself by now. And that's... It used to be from Nirvana the band. Kids have no idea who Nirvana is, but they wear the shirt. The term Nirvana used to mean something Buddhist, but Nirvana took that. And so constantly something will get taken away from you and change. That's out of your hand. Love is primary. Just follow that. So that's what I guide myself by now. And that's given me some sanity. The way I imagine it is almost like a pendulum. And instead of now swinging it to the other side, which was me before, trying to avoid, no, I don't want to think it, don't want to think that. That makes it come back. It's a gentle nudge to the center. I try not to run from it, but it's not the same as facing it, which is what I thought I had to do. It's more the same of just, interesting. Change. That's out of your hand. Love is my relationship with my wife and love. And so if I have to sacrifice a toe day of studying,
Okay.
it's not a toe. It's like I used to love. They will become zero, but don't think that. And then also to accept the thoughts, but not merge with them, not fuse with them. Accept simply means acknowledge softly, gently. I see you, thought, interesting that you're there. I don't need to take you seriously, and then just go to where your values are, and you commit to where your values are, which is where the control comes in. So you have to have some values. So my values are my wife and love and this world, and seeing behind my eyes and actually feeling like I'm behind my eyes, which was not there for 2 months or so. Like, it's depersonalized. Anyway, I've come to the decision now that what matters is it's not a toe. It's like I used to love toe, like doing everything, speaking to and learning great theories, and I still love that. I still do. That actually gives me some sanity if it's not consciousness related, if it's metaphysics, because it's dispassionate. But what's primary is my relationship with my wife and love. And so if I have to sacrifice a toe day of studying to go spend time with my wife, I do, almost invariably. That was never there before. Work comes first before. Now it's like, no. Curt, almost everything may fade in some manner. All of what I'm putting out on YouTube may fit. People may take it out of context. People may shape it, just like the Nirvana logo. Kids wear it. It used to be from Nirvana the band. Kids have no idea who Nirvana is, but they wear the shirt. The term Nirvana used to mean something Buddhist, but Nirvana took that. And so constantly something will get taken away from you and change. That's out of your hand. Love is primary. Just follow that. So that's what I guide myself by now. And that's given me some sanity. The way I imagine it is almost like a pendulum. And instead of now swinging it to the other side, which is what I'm trying to avoid.
That's awesome to hear, because I have had this similar journey, and I talk about marriage a lot on here. And I really cannot stress enough that if you are attracted to the opposite sex, it is your moral responsibility to get married. It's not a choice that you could just make, and one choice of not getting married, choice of getting married, they're not, like, that doesn't matter. Like, it's just your choice. It's not your choice. I mean, it is your choice, but it is also moral, like, has moral implications. It is a moral decision. And to choose not to get married is an immoral decision. If you are physically attracted to the opposite sex, it is your moral responsibility to get married. It is. And we are supposed to take care of each other. But it is also, that's not a bad thing. Like, my most important thing in my life is my wife at this point. She is the only thing that gives me, like, stability. Like, really true stability. And that's amazing. That woman is amazing. I mean, I have, like a reptile zoo, okay, and a theory of everything, and like a bunch of weapons, and like study martial arts and shooting, and like I don't know, I was like very politically opinionated for quite some time. Still am, but just not. It just doesn't make me angry anymore. Like, that is a lot to deal with. So, I mean, I could not be more grateful for anything in my life more than my wife, other than God. And there is such a stability that is so necessary. It says in the Bible, it is not good for man to be alone. That is so true. That guys, like, I wouldn't even sleep at normal. I barely sleep on a normal schedule. I would not sleep at all before I was married on any kind of good or normal or healthy schedule. And or I don't know, like, it's just so, there's so many things about just being married that is very important. It's like different. It's internally important for men, and it is like physically important for women more so. But it's both. But it's just what's the focus. But it was great to hear Curt say that. I think that that's a very good thing for him to like be talking about. I think more men who are married need to start talking about like the perks of marriage, because there are infinite perks of marriage. We literally live in a society where it has just been, and this is pertaining to the theory of everything, like, if there was a theory of everything that wasn't sentient singularity theory, and it was about a mechanism instead of like a I don't know, like if it wasn't sentient beings that were defining the theory of everything, it would be marriage. That's a fact. We are your cells are married to you in a marriage relationship with you. And Bernardo Kastrup said, what if a flower just thought the world was about itself instead of about the tree? Well, what if a cell thinks that it's about itself instead of about the human? You get cancer. Like, that is what happens. You cannot get out of you need a hierarchical relationship that is also gosh, what's the word? Where it's like you have a choice. It's consensual. You need a consensual hierarchy. You need a structure that allows for a consensual and hierarchical relationship in order to have order and meaning in the world. If you get rid of consensuality, I don't even know how to consent. If you get rid of consent, you get rid of sovereignty. If you get rid of sovereignty, you get rid of meaning, because you get rid of multiplicity. If you get rid of hierarchy, you get rid of order. And so in order to have order and meaning, which you need both, to have growth, like, otherwise you will have decay. With the only thing that can happen if you don't have order and meaning is decay. You need meaning to motivate it and hold things together, and you need order that is the structure that is things being growing, and everything else is just decay. So that structure is marriage. This is a speech that I gave as a best man. I've been wanting to share this for a while, and it just was so relevant to what Curt said that I wanted to share it. I've never shared this before, but it's pretty good. I've never given a speech that was a best man speech before, but it was. It turned out okay. I actually had everybody laughing, and it's about the importance of marriage.
That's not. I wrote a speech. I guess if you. Okay. Hi, I'm Tyler. First, I would like to thank everyone who helped make this beautiful day possible. That means everyone who took time out of their lives to come here today to celebrate with Brian and Janae Year of College at Northern Arizona University.
Okay, hold on.
The bugs, not your parents' siblings. He has an ant farm, and he watches a surprisingly popular show online called Ants Canada.
Hold on one second. I'm just gonna get to the relevant part.
Brian and Nathan and I were watching. Brian found someone who not only puts up with his weirdness, but also participates in it.
Here.
Those are the people you want as your partners to tackle life with. And the people in our lives are what matter most. This was also evident by this past weekend when I attempted to organize a camping trip for Brian's bachelor party. I say attempted because absolutely nothing went according to plan. We got started late, had to find a new location, and to top it off, I threw my back out and was basically a burden the entire weekend. All that considered, thanks to the people we were with and some beautiful views, the trip ended up being much better than it ever could have been had our plans actually worked out. It was like a perfect metaphor for life. They say that we make plans and God laughs, but the one plan you can control is who you have by your side as you experience the blessings and curveballs that come your way. Your spouse is the one constant that you have to hold on to when you need it, and you always need it. I've already seen Brian and Adrian up in there.
Okay, I don't want to like get into their personal stuff, but on here, but I will say like that last point is important. Where, and my apologies for jumping around that, but like you need a constant, and like there's two constants: God and your spouse, and your spouse is like constant, but it's things happen, but at the same time, like it's meant to be a permanent relationship, and but there's meaning is not truly like, it's hard to feel like your life has ultimate meaning in relationships outside of permanence. Why would you matter that much in any relationship that isn't permanent? So I was speaking to some group of people once, and very high IQs, didn't seem to help, about marriage, and they were like, well, everybody defines marriage differently. And I was like, well, it's a permanent relationship. Can we agree on that? And they were like, no, some people, marriage is not meant to be permanent, which just means that's not marriage. Like, it's very important to meaning, and it's very important to like keeping your sanity. I realize I jumped around on that. I thought more of it was relevant than it was to this, but hopefully you heard it. And I will say, like, they all seem, Curt and Chris and Bernardo all seem to basically at the end of this stream talk about like God and how just the importance of that. We all some people use different terms for that, consciousness system, or like universal consciousness, or universe, or mind of nature or something, whatever. But it is, if you believe that it is a sentient being, that is what matters. And it is a profoundly perspective-altering view of the world to believe that it is a sentient being. It impacts every aspect of everything you do. And I don't even know how you could have a discussion like the one that between these the three guys in this stream, if one of them, if it was like a debate between like Bill Nye and like a rabbi or something, like you just couldn't do it, or Chris Langan and Bill Nye, or Bernardo Kastrup and Bill Nye, like you couldn't do it. It would be a meaningless and time wasting discussion. But it is very cool to see God coming back. I said at the very beginning of this project, in one of the very first videos I uploaded, that the scientists of the past that made the most progress were theists, and that atheism has been a very temporary worldview, and that it was not going to last long, and that it was on its way out, essentially. And it certainly looks like that is the case, and it's very cool to see. So I don't have any other clips that I think are really that important. I'm just going to answer questions and go. Like I said, I appreciate everybody that stuck it out. I realize the end was a bit disjointed, but You can go watch it. I don't want to like discuss exactly what they said about God. It seemed like Curt was saying that God has become a part of his life. That is super awesome to hear if that's accurate. Like, and it's like, I don't know. I don't want to judge it, because if I'm judging it wrongly, then that is, I don't want to do that. But and it seems like I know Chris Langan's views on God, and I can deduce Bernardo's based on his everything else views. But to see even Bernardo Kastrup be happy hearing that implies like an understanding, and to know what he said and what he said about interpreting Jesus and Buddha, and with a level of depth, I would say that really only a theist can do. Like, he might call himself an idealist, but I would call him a theist. It's good to see theism making a comeback. All right, final questions, then I'm going to go. Gosh, there's a lot. Desire is a triangle mimetic. We are shaped by those around us. Individual is not a thing. That's not true. Individual is absolutely a thing, but you're also part of a collective. It's both. Tom Campbell has an amazing ASMR voice. He does have an interesting voice. Telesis is the impulse to benefit. Yes, will is part of that impulse to benefit. Okay, I didn't know that. Why is turbulence the last unsolved problem in classical mechanics? Don't know. Super literal free will. If you have to hate those bots, yeah, hate the bots in the chat. I'm gonna delete those bots. But there was a lot of more that we could have talked about, but it's just so long that like I could go on forever, guys. But I appreciate, like I said, everybody who was here, and hope you got something out of it. I think Chris talks in parts of it that I did want to talk about a bit, is just like how reality constructs itself, and like I've talked about this before with my models, is just like you can't just use equations like algebraic equations. You have to like have equations within cells that are in a specific place because of relevance, and so you can see my structures do that. I thought that was cool to listen to him talk about. I think that that's important. It just shows like we need a new medium. You can't just have a theory of everything be represented in algebraic equations. Basically, you're using a subjective field to try and define and describe objectivity. You can't do it. You're limited in how you do it, at least. But there's lots of things. I highly recommend watching their entire stream. I'm not going to get into it further, but you can watch it. And it was great. My hat's off to all of them. It takes bravery to have these discussions. And it takes bravery to make advances in understanding any subject, and it takes bravery to advance science. You're not going to advance science by not pissing anybody off and not being brave. You're gonna need to be brave. You're gonna need to entertain ideas that the establishment is against. You're gonna need to associate with people who are blacklisted sometimes, and like you're gonna need to stick to your guns when you think that you are onto something, despite it any consequences of it, professionally. So it's just good to see people seeming to become more and more brave. It seems like it's entirely outside the institutions of physics. And I know there's like a little bit here and there, like But as far as theorists, physics theorists, I mean, in the institutions, none of them are physicists that are making progress. They're all computer scientists and philosophers, and you know, Sarah Walker, I think she's a molecular biologist or something like that. She's not a physicist. I don't think she's a physicist. But Eric Weinstein's a mathematician. Like, it's just weird. But it is the way that it was always going to be. It's very cool, though. Anyways, peace, guys. And until next week, please hit the like button and share this with anybody you found who you think would find meaningful. If you would like to join our weekly Discord call, private message me on Instagram, linked below, and I will send you the link to our Discord. And we have a weekly call that's live at 7 p.m. Pacific time on Thursdays, every Thursday. You can ask me questions about whatever you want. And link to my website I've been working on is below as well, and to my Instagrams and other places where you can find this content. So